Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Hyman, and I chair the Federalist Society's International and National Security Law Practice Group. For those that don't know what the Federalist Society is, allow me a moment to do a quick PSA, and then we'll get on with our program. The Federalist Society is a membership organization comprised primarily of libertarian and conservatives that are interested in the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. The Society seeks both to promote an awareness of these principles and to further their application through its activities. On behalf of the Federalist Society and AEI, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Unraveling the Web, Dismantling Transnational Organized Crime Networks in the Americas. Before introducing today's keynote speaker, I want to thank AEI for its terrific collaboration in bringing this event together. And its kind hospitality for hosting us all today. I also want to recognize a few individuals in particular that were critical to this event coming together. The first is Dean Reuter of the Federalist Society, Roger Noriega of AEI, and Jim Dunlop of Jones Day and the Federalist Society. They drove the planning for today's discussion. I also want to thank our expert panelists for what I know will be a lively and informative conversation, and our audience both here and those viewing us via the live stream. With that, it's my privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker, Marshall Billingslea. Mr. Billingslea is the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes in the Department of the Treasury. In this role, he works with members of the national security community throughout the U.S. government, foreign governments, and the private sector to identify and address threats posed or advanced by illicit finance. His areas of focus include money laundering, terrorist financing, WMD proliferation, and other criminal and illicit activities domestically and across borders. This past August, he was nominated to be the next Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. Prior to this stint in government service, Mr. Billingslea was a managing director with Deloitte Financial Advisory Services, where he ran the Federal Business Intelligence Services Group. He specialized in investigating beneficial ownership structures and advising businesses on the legal and regulatory risks associated with third-party transactions, particularly those in overseas markets. In addition to the Treasury, Mr. Billingslea's government career spans multiple positions within the Departments of Defense and State and the United States Senate. Mr. Billingslea holds a Bachelor of Arts from Dartmouth College and a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Tufts University. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Billingslea to the podium.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful welcome, and it's really a pleasure to be here today with members of the Federalist Society, AEI, and a number of friends and colleagues who I've had the pleasure of getting to know and work with on a wide range of Western Hemisphere issues, including the topic of transnational organized crime. AEI has done some fairly crucial work on this topic, and my team in particular brought to my attention the report that was published last summer on the Western Hemisphere and on TOC threats. I think it's important to recognize that even as the Treasury Department, along with the rest of our national security infrastructure, is focused on global threats posed by countries such as Iran, North Korea, and Russia, it is essential that we must maintain vigilance and maintain a high level of pressure on the organizations that pose acute dangers to us and to our homeland here via transnational criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. It is among the highest priorities of my office to disrupt these networks and to keep the focus on the Western Hemisphere itself. We have, as noted, been working very closely with international partners, as well as other U.S. government departments and agencies, and I'm gratified that we've got broad participation in some of the panels later today along those lines. The President's Executive Order 13773 made clear that its issuance was designed to reinvigorate the United States government's focus and efforts against transnational organized crime. And it called for a comprehensive and decisive approach to dismantle these organized crime syndicates and restore safety for the American people, unquote. My Treasury has been working independently and as part of an interagency effort as called for in that executive order to implement that vision. I'd also highlight, and I think most of you are aware, that the Attorney General just this past month announced the creation of a task force at the Department of Justice focused on 5 priority threat actors. 4 of these 5, and that's CJ&G, and I will include Los Quinis, which is their professional anti-money laundering syndicate that's associated with CJ&G in that. MS-13, the Gulf Cartel, and the Sinaloa Cartel all operate primarily in the Western Hemisphere, hence our focus. And the 5th, Lebanese Hezbollah, has got a very robust presence in the tri-border area. TCOs pose a threat to the integrity of our financial system here and the financial systems of our friends and our allies. In addition to their heinous acts of violence and activities that expose U.S. citizens to the deadly effects of illegal drugs, TCOs launder and they place those drug proceeds into our American financial system and into the financial systems of our region through the movement of bulk cash, through structuring of deposits, through trade-based and other money laundering schemes. Our most recent national money laundering risk assessment, which was published in 2015 and is in the process of being updated, estimated at that time that around $64 billion was generated annually from the sale of drugs in the United States, with Mexico being the primary supplier and transit zone for certain of those drugs, Colombia being, of course, the leading provider of cocaine. Based on our updating of this risk assessment and our engagement through that process with law enforcement, we believe that figure has increased substantially. So turning to the specific threats posed by TCOs and criminal actors in the Western Hemisphere, it's important that we get very specific. Mexico is home to several large TCOs, and we in the Treasury invest significant time in identifying the money laundering operations of these organizations and working with the Mexican government to disrupt them. And here I'm focusing particularly on the Sinaloa Cartel, the Zetas, and CJ&G. For over 15 years, Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control has targeted the assets of major Colombian narcotics traffickers and their criminal organizations. And my former office in the Department of Defense, SOLIC, was heavily involved in disruption of FARC efforts, the disruption of Pablo Escobar before them, and so on. We work very closely together. And we continue to focus on leaders and members of both the Cali and North Valle drug cartels, the FARC, and the AUC, among others. And we operate through an executive order, 12978, as well as the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Act, the Kingpin Act, which has resulted in the freezing and the disruption in billions of proceeds associated with these organizations. We also are now beginning to zero in on the emerging threats across the region, such as those posed in Central America by gangs and by money laundering organizations that have been operating for some time in Honduras and Panama. The adverse effect of the criminal activities of these gangs is most evident in the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where gang activity, you can see the active depression of foreign investment as a result of the gang activity, and you can see the ensuing migration that results. In the Northern Triangle, gangs such as MS-13 raise significant sums of money through extortion of small to medium-sized companies, and they operate transportation networks and even continue to operate brazenly from prison when they are imprisoned. Their actions have displaced innocent people from their homes, threatened the lives of entrepreneurs in these countries who've been forced to shut down what otherwise would have been productive businesses, and have limited, therefore, people's abilities to take advantage of job growth, job creation, and educational opportunities, or even to move around in their own hometowns. Worst of all, the victims are forced to keep paying these gangs on a regular extorted basis to avoid becoming targets. There are also very real consequences for us here in the United States. Gangs have used our financial system, particularly money service businesses in this case, to fund operations in the Northern Triangle, and they extort Americans in our communities here as well. We also have to be vigilant against the threats posed by terrorists. So I mentioned the Mexican structures we're dealing with. I mentioned the Colombian organized structures that we're dealing with, the gangs in Central America. But we have to recognize that Lebanese Hezbollah has a deep and substantial footprint in the Western Hemisphere. And they use the cover of seemingly legitimate businesses in the tri-border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay to collect donations across Latin America in their attempts to both exploit our financial system and funnel money for terrorist operations in the Middle East and elsewhere. As many of you know, Treasury also has significantly increased its efforts to target the repressive conduct of one of the largest criminal enterprises in the Western Hemisphere, if not the largest criminal enterprise in the Western Hemisphere, which is the regime of Maduro. The Venezuelan government, the kleptocracy of Venezuela, is the economic strategy of that regime. And Venezuela is a major, major priority for us. We have not seen the kind of criminal conduct on this scale in the Western Hemisphere prior to Maduro's ascension to power. Embezzlement, graft, fraud, all designed to maintain the loyalty of regime insiders who support his continued dictatorial rule. The most widely known corruption scheme used by the regime has been the absolute embezzlement of anything not bolted down associated with PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. But the Venezuelan government and elements within it are also involved heavily in drug trafficking and illegal mining schemes. And more abhorrent, perhaps, than any of that, if you can believe it, is that Maduro uses limitations on humanitarian food aid, restrictions on food aid into the country where people are starving, where the average weight loss is more than 25 pounds, where children are dying 5 and 6 a day now as a result of lack of access to medicines, basic medicines, basic things. He restricts that access in order to further loot the so-called CLAP program, which is the food aid box program. And I want to be very clear with you. The CLAP program is not a humanitarian assistance program. It is a method of social control and repression that Maduro uses not only to control the population, but to enrich himself and others. In Nicaragua, we also are greatly concerned about the human rights abuses being committed there and the brutal violence that was unleashed by the Ortega regime in response to completely legitimate demands for democratic reform, as well as now by the actions of senior Nicaraguan officials to move and launder corruption proceeds from Nicaragua through offshore locations, including the United States. To combat these vast and complex networks, it is essential that we have friends and allies in the fight with us. Mexico has been such a great partner, and I look forward to continuing the cooperation with the new government once they take office here in just a few weeks. We are strengthening together our anti-money laundering and CFT, countering the financing of terrorism regimes, across the region as we continue to strengthen our regime here in the United States. With Mexico, we co-lead a working group that improves information sharing between our governments and our private sectors, the banks and others, on illicit finance. We also contribute to operational activities by exchanging highly specific lead information with one another on specific targets, entities that we wish the Mexican authorities to investigate and to take action against. In the case of Colombia, we have an outstanding working relationship with the Finance Ministry of Colombia and with its Financial Intelligence Unit, and with other Colombian authorities, who, in collaboration with us, have seized over $2 billion in assets since 2004 related to joint investigations with OFAC, with our Office of Foreign Asset Control, and the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Drug Enforcement Administration. The sheer volume of assets seized in Colombia demonstrates, of course it's just a fraction of the total, right, demonstrates the immense wealth that these organizations wield, and that we have to continually strengthen our joint efforts against these organizations. In Central America, we chair a dialogue between the United States and regional authorities, again, with the private sector, because the private sector is our first line and our front line of defense in all of these matters. We depend heavily on the banks and other financial institutions to serve as that tripwire to alert the United States and other authorities when suspicious activities are in the offing. And our work with Central American countries includes recent collaboration to identify vulnerabilities in the Central American financial system and the threats posed by extortion and narcotic trafficking, particularly associated here with MS-13 and by Barrio 18. In the tri-border area, in response to the threat posed by that terrorist financing dimension of Hezbollah, we are working with authorities in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, all three now, to address the risks and vulnerabilities associated with Hezbollah operations. And we believe that we are going to now start to make significant strides forward together in a way that perhaps has not been seen in the past, working against Hezbollah. And I think we're already seeing that bear fruit. Argentine and Paraguayan authorities have recently taken action on their own against a money laundering network in the area. And in Brazil, in September, they arrested an OFAC-designated Hezbollah financier who Paraguay is seeking to prosecute for identity theft charges. Treasury itself has taken more actions against Hezbollah's illicit activities around the world this year than at any other time in that organization's history. And we are fully committed to denying Hezbollah reach or access into the Western Hemisphere, and we intend to degrade that access globally. And I have to really commend the Argentinian authorities and the Paraguayan authorities and now the Brazilian authorities for the joint work that they are conducting on this topic. With Argentina, as I mentioned, we have a recurring bilateral dialogue on illicit finance that identifies and shares information on money laundering, terrorist financing, and other types of typologies. How do they do it? What does it look like? What's a generic case study that you can use to monitor your financial system for threats? And we've also been able to strengthen our cooperation with Argentina to combat Venezuelan corruption networks, as I mentioned. So, to conclude here on Venezuela, I want to focus on one particular network that illustrates the sophistication and reach of these TCO organizations. We have issued advisories recently, both in English and Spanish, to our financial institutions to assist them in identifying these kinds of typologies. And while we've designated more than 100 individuals and entities that are linked to the government of Venezuela's rampant corruption, their human rights abuses, and their undemocratic behavior, particular focus needs to be given to Diosdado Caballo. Earlier this year, we targeted a network supporting Caballo, including his testaferro, his frontman, Rafael Soria. And in September, we went after an additional piece of that network associated with Soria's brother, some private jets that we found, and other shell company structures that had been established in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Caballo maintains significant leadership positions in Venezuela since Chavez elevated him to the position of Minister of Interior and Justice initially. Caballo has abused at every step of the way his influential positions in furtherance of his illicit and corrupt activities. And he controls and directs government agencies and military officials in Venezuela for that purpose. He has an entrenched network of supporters, and the way he maintains that is because he simply decides who gets promoted within agencies and ministries such as the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Public Works. Caballo, in turn, has used that sphere of influence to personally profit from extortion, from money laundering, and embezzlement. For instance, as of December of 2016, Venezuelan officials associated with Caballo were using state-owned enterprises, including Venalum, which is the aluminum structure, and Alunasa, Aluminos Nacionales S.A., to launder money to Costa Rica and Russia. The president of Venalum, as well as another individual who ran the company, were engaged in drug trafficking and money laundering and used Venalum as a cover for these operations. Under the direction of now U.S. designated Francisco Jose Rangel Gomez, in his capacity as the governor of the state of Bolivar, Venalum used boats to move minerals and to launder money through Panama to the Costa Rican branch of Alunasa, and Caballo was directing the Venezuelan military to place several Alunasa employees in Costa Rica to oversee this entire operation. In addition, Caballo was laundering money through Venalum to Russia. On top of the money laundering and the illegal mineral exports, Caballo is also directly involved in narcotics trafficking. Working with Tariq El-Assami, who we've also designated pursuant to the Kingpin Act, Caballo continues to organize drug shipments being moved from Venezuela through jurisdictions such as the Dominican Republic and then onwards to Europe. Caballo also directs Pedro Luis Martin Olivares, who was designated pursuant to the Kingpin Act in May of this year. In late 2016, Caballo and Martin came up with a scheme to move illicit money to Panama, the Dominican Republic, and the Bahamas. And as of March of last year, he was actually just seizing drug loads on his own from small-scale drug traffickers, combining them, bundling them, and exporting them onwards through the Venezuelan government-owned airport, through a Venezuelan government-owned airport. And Caballo, along with President Maduro and others, then divvied up the proceeds from these narcotic shipments. My point on this is that under the patina of the Maduro regime, this network has wide reach. And to combat it, it is essential that we work with friendly governments, whether we're talking about Mexico, but I would add Canada, Panama is an outstanding partner, the European Union, the United Kingdom in particular, and other countries across Latin America to build the legal regimes necessary so that our partner nations can implement their own sanctions regimes, not simply rely upon us for the action, but to take action themselves, to have their own ability to block proceeds and to freeze funds, in particular so that we can disrupt this massive Venezuelan corruption conglomerate. So our cooperation to tackle TCOs outside of our borders not only is helping halt threats abroad, but it also reduces the threats these organizations pose to our own financial system. In the forthcoming money laundering risk assessment that you will see us release, you're going to find that we pay particular attention to two vulnerabilities we see now most in use in the United States, and that is the misuse of legal entities through the masking of beneficial ownership structure and real estate. With respecting to the detection of use of legal entities, that collection of that beneficial ownership information is essential. And so our customer due diligence rule, which we imposed in May of this year, on May 11th, now requires financial institutions to identify and verify the beneficial owners of companies opening new accounts. That in turn bolsters the ability of our law enforcement agencies to investigate misuse of legal entities for the purpose of establishing bank accounts and otherwise structuring proceeds through the system. We also are looking heavily at illicit finance typologies associated with property, and we've released advisories on how the real estate sector is in fact being abused, not just by organized groups operating out of Venezuela, but actually globally. We see Russian money here, we see other funds coming into the real estate sector. Finally, this year, in our capacity as having the presidency of the Financial Action Task Force, which is the standard-setting body for all anti-money laundering regimes, we are pushing to develop new standards for the supervision and regulation of virtual assets to make the financing, the illicit financing, and the organized criminal financing using cryptocurrency more difficult and more challenging by elevating global standards against those activities. Again, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and appreciate the Federalist Society and AEI hosting this event, and I look forward to talking with Roger and ultimately answering any questions you may have for me. Thank you.
Have a seat, Marshall. Very well done. Very thorough. I crossed off all my questions, so I'll just sit here quietly. You've been a very busy man. You're off a lot of Christmas card lists from the Russians and the mullahs don't send Christmas cards, but I'm sure you're not one of their favorite people. But after your presentation today, Gustavo Cabello, you might want to increase your security detail, but that's just my friendly advice. Thank you very much for coming. You talked a lot about Venezuela and some of what they're doing internally, which has international implications. But what would be your answer to the question if President Trump were to ask you, is Venezuela a national security threat to the United States?
Well, my answer would be straightforward. Venezuela poses a clear threat to regional stability and security. And on top of the horrific humanitarian crisis that's unfolding before our very eyes, and we've never seen a collapse like this in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And I would submit that we cannot take it as a given. That cannot be allowed to happen, because in addition to the suffering of the Venezuelan people, we're seeing the spillover and knock-on effects that threaten to drag down key allies such as Colombia, Brazil. It's affecting the Brazilians. It's affecting Ecuador. It's affecting Argentina. So this is a hemispheric issue, and the implosion of the regime there is a direct challenge for us.
You also mentioned the freezing of assets, by blocking especially designated nationals' access to financial system that effectively blocks their assets in financial institutions. It's a global phenomenon. There's some estimate that these folks have looted $350 billion. That's a conservative number. What have you been able to do? What are your expectations in terms of being able to to seize these assets, essentially forfeit these assets, and eventually return them to a democratically elected successor government in Venezuela? And has the international community been working with you on that? What sort of strides do we have to make here at home and then with our partners to make sure that most of that money makes its way back?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we are working very, very closely, in fact, with the very countries that I sort of singled out in my remarks, with the government of Mexico, with Colombia, with Panama, Argentina, Spain, and others on this. Obviously, I want to stay away from any particulars, but you have, I think, seen the fruits of that collaboration in recent days with a number of arrests and blockages. I was very pleased to see the decision by some of the companies in Mexico to pay into the UN Human Rights Commission for Refugees to pay funds into that program that had been previously associated with the CLAP program, as an example. The first step is to find the funds. The second step is to put the block on them. The ultimately asset forfeiture, I would defer to my Department of Justice colleagues on those methodologies, particularly for repatriation of funds. But it is important for the Venezuelan people to understand that we are on the hunt for Maduro and Celia Flores' money, and we're not going to stop until we find it.
Certainly, it's a pretty big target. Let's pull out a little bit.
Let me rephrase that. It's not their money.
Right.
Money they stole.
Right, absolutely. Pull out a little bit to a higher perspective. You've been in this job for 16 months, roughly. What gaps do you see in terms of the tools available to the United States government to address this phenomenon, not only here but around the globe? Do you need additional resources for investigations or legal authorities where Treasury could do a more effective job than it's already doing?
That's a good question. I think a couple of things. One of the areas that I've been very focused internally within the Department of Treasury is to bring some of the new and emergent technologies that I benefited from when I was at Deloitte, relating to the use of commercially available, publicly available information, advanced data analytic techniques, data mining techniques, different kinds of graph databasing technologies to really provide a technology refresh to how our people conduct investigations. Secondly, the work that, because we're all people, we change jobs, we do different things in life, you have to continually refresh your relationship with the private sector. And that is vital. Again, as I mentioned, the private sector is in many respects our first line of defense in all these things. In terms of other authorities, one of the things I mentioned is the desire to have other countries with similar sanctions regime legal authorities, so that when we engage in a joint action together, yes, they may go in and conduct arrests or other things, but we need them to have the legal authority to immediately put that block, to put that freeze on the account, or to engage in their own sanctions actions. And so we've been working with a number of jurisdictions to improve that. So those would be just a few examples.
Sure. I was surprised that For example, only in the last 2 years did the Canadians adopt authorities to be able to do the same kind of blocking access to their financial system.
On the one hand, but on the other hand, they immediately put that to good effect. When you
Absolutely.
see they've gone after the Maduro regime as actively as any other country in the world.
Absolutely. The Canadians
been
are
great partners on that.
terrific on this. I didn't mean by any means to criticize. And what kind of cooperation are you getting from Congress?
Outstanding cooperation from Congress. These are, particularly when we're talking about the influx, and I talked about cocaine, and obviously we have heroin coming in now from the Western Hemisphere, but the opioid epidemic. I mean, these are not political issues. These are issues that we all agree on the necessity for preventing this and from stopping the illegal proceeds from warping our financial system and the financial systems of other friendly countries. The only plea I have with Congress is that particularly with organizations like Diosdado Caballos, the element of surprise is essential. And so mandatory sanctions or things which force us to tip our hand on what we're intending to do are not helpful. And so we tend to want to push back on that one aspect of help that we sometimes get.
I'm going to go to the audience in a couple of seconds here. I'll ask you, there's folks with mics, and I'll recognize you, and then you please be prepared to ask some questions to participate. What keeps you up nights about this phenomenon? For example, a good colleague told me that these criminal organizations are now using new methods where they can basically dump all of their money from all of their vendors and suppliers and all into one account. So they never actually move out into the financial system to where it could be detected by folks like you. That was kind of a blood-curdling reality that these folks are way out ahead of us in certain ways, certainly ahead of what we can do in terms of tooling up a bureaucracy and putting a team together to go after them. What worries you when you study this problem?
Well, I mean, it's not so much worrying as it's just recognizing what we're up against. And we're up against organizations that in some cases command billions of dollars in assets and really can afford the best money can buy in terms of accountants, tax advisors, bankers, and others who then set up and enable these sophisticated laundering schemes. The good news is that there's not an infinite number of ways you can launder money. And so while some of the details vary on the margins, the core phenomenology, I think, is something that the Treasury Department, together with our colleagues in law enforcement, have a fairly reasonable understanding of the workings. One of the areas, though, where we have to get out in front of this, where we perhaps don't, I think, at this stage, truly understand how this is going to evolve, is in the blockchain technologies and in the virtual currencies and crypto assets that are being associated with these different kinds of distributed ledgers. And that's why we have made, my presidency at the FATF, the singular focus has been to get agreement that there will be the application of anti-money laundering standards to these digital assets. Mm-hmm. We just got that agreement this past month in October, but the devil's in the details. Mm-hmm. And so by June, we will be publishing the guidance and the interpretive note on how that standard will be applied and how countries, including the United States, how we will all, because this is a peer review process, how we're all going to be assessed on the effectiveness to which we regulate this new technological area.
Terrific. Great answer. All right, so questions got a gentleman in the back there. Please, your name and your affiliation and a question which is a string of words ending with a question mark.
I have many of them, if you like. Ian Talley, Wall Street Journal. Good to see you. Thank you for doing this. There has been a push and momentum for better disclosure of beneficiary ownership that seems to continue to stall and has stalled for many years in Congress. And it seems recently that the two primary opponents to this has been the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Legal Association, I forgot, Bar Association. I don't think that I can understand their objections, however. For the Chamber of Commerce, I truly don't understand, particularly when it comes to price transparency being a critical factor in market economies, right? And beneficiary ownership bringing about greater price transparency. I don't understand the legal argument brought by the ABA. Perhaps you can help me to understand, if you think that there's worth in their arguments, why beneficiary ownership should continue to be private and not federally sort of encouraged.
Well, I'm not going to try to make the case for others. I'll leave that to them. But Ian, what I would tell you is, as I mentioned, transparency in legal and the incorporation and establishment of legal operating entities in the United States is essential. And that is precisely why on May 11th we imposed the CDD, the Customer Due Diligence Rule, that has gone into effect with our banks. But I think there's a view by some in the Senate and the House that more can be done, particularly when it comes to incorporation of companies at the state level. Our challenge is from a constitutional standpoint, is simply that the incorporation of entities is something that is done at the state level. So it's not something that we can simply mandate with some kind of statute, as I understand it. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is we can't simply mandate that that registries, corporate registries, be established and maintained and that they be accessible. I would say in my private sector career, the job I had, the teams I ran, benefited greatly when we had access to that kind of information, because it really sped up their ability to understand who you were transacting with. And I think the Secretary of the Treasury has made very clear that he is both open and willing to work with members of Congress on this, because this is a very, very important topic, especially for our law enforcement colleagues.
Other questions, please? This gentleman up front.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. This is a kind of a small, minor question, but you mentioned the tri-border area several times, and in relation to Hezbollah. I remember maybe 5 or 10 years ago reading about the presence of terrorists from the Mideast in that exact same area, but they didn't particularly mention Hezbollah in those days. It was more Al-Qaeda, various other people. So could you have a little background about what's the interest in that particular area for these people? And does it have a history with other groups, not just Hezbollah?
Well, I mean, look, Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran, right? So Hassan Nasrallah does the bidding of the Ayatollah, the supreme leader. And so wherever there is Hezbollah, there is Iranian influence by definition. The tri-border area is home to a number of organized Hezbollah groups, amongst them the Barakat group, which both has been the subject of our sanctions, as well as some of the recent actions that I mentioned. But it is a large and well-established infrastructure that Hezbollah has built in that area.
It's interesting that my sources tell me that Tarek al-Assami's pilot was traveled in and out of Paraguay about 6 or 8 days ago, but he made his way out of the country. Are there other questions? None? Oh, well, no.
No, we can go ahead to Ian.
Yeah, let's go back. Let's have a follow-up.
Well, just following up on that point, to what extent can FATF be effective in encouraging that regional compliance judicial level or governmental level in Paraguay or elsewhere, where there seem to continue to be disappearing traffickers associated with Hezbollah?
It can be helpful, I think, in at least 2 ways. So one thing that was started actually under the Argentinian presidency by the current Deputy Justice Minister who preceded me was the inclusion of prosecutors in the various exchanges, training programs, and workshops hosted under FATF auspices, so that the prosecutorial dimension to all of this gets considered and factored. And one of the decisions we made in following on to the Argentinian presidency was to continue that and to further expand the inclusion of the judicial process alongside the intelligence and law enforcement processes that are necessary. The second way that the FATF can and does help is that we work, there's the 38 countries that are in the FATF itself, but the total network is more than 200 countries because each of the countries participate in regional, FATF-style regional bodies. And so we work very, very closely with the regional bodies to ensure that the FATF standards are being rigorously assessed when each country has its turn at bat, and its anti-money laundering, its counter the financing of terrorism regime, its counter-proliferation financing regimes are being assessed. And so it's really that driving of the standards and greatly enabled by the fact that the private sector, the financial institutions, watch the results of these mutual evaluations very, very closely because it's an indicator of risk. And so, again, it's that power of working with the private sector, but ultimately insisting on the adhering to standards.
Well, I have one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes, Douglas Farah, National Defense University. In our field research, we keep coming across Turks now in the sale of gold, the purchase of gold, weapon shipments going into Central America, particularly a lot into Panama and elsewhere, a lot of money movements through Turkey. Is that something you're observing now as well? And is Turkey playing a new role in the architecture of these criminal states as they move their resources?
I wouldn't be able to comment on all the specifics, but I would say that one of the areas that we are urging awareness of is the massive looting that's now being done in Venezuela of gold. It's being done at not just illegally, but it's being done at enormous environmental expense and at the expense of the indigenous populations there, as the regime has basically awarded itself control over a huge percentage of the country and is now stripping this gold out and dumping massive amounts of chemical and mercury contaminants into water supplies. And in tandem with that, we've really stressed the importance for companies and countries to be vigilant and to understand what's happening here. And we have highlighted the fact that a lot of this non-monetary gold appears to be destined for Turkey.
Well, thank you there very much. You've handled it, all of the topics very thoroughly, obviously. I think that the administration, most of close observers would say that in this area definitely has exceeded expectations. And I think that the audience would agree that after witnessing your work here today, your presentation, your appreciation of the issue in some detail, that you've contributed a lot to that success, and we thank you very much for helping us out this morning.
Well, thank you for hosting.
Thanks. Appreciate it, Marshall. Thanks very much. Please keep your seats. We're going to ask other panelists to join us, and we'll continue immediately. If some Selena and Doug and Emmanuel. Let me read the bios here briefly. Selena Riaño is professor of practice at William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National Defense University and has 2 decades of international experience in the public, private, and academic sectors. She has experience as an international banker with Goldman Sachs, the State Department's Director of Counterterrorism Finance Programs, and a professor at the National Defense University, George Washington University, and Joint Special Operations University. Doug Farah is president of IBI Consultants, LLC, and a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic Research at the National Defense University, and works as a subject matter expert on transnational organized crime and threat networks in Latin America, advising both the United States government and the private sector. Manuel Ottolenghi is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and works with its Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. He is an expert on Hezbollah's illicit threat networks in Latin America and Iran's history of sanctions evasion. He previously headed the Transatlantic Institute in Brussels. I thank all of our panelists, all of whom participated to one degree or another in the production of this report that AEI issued in June 2017, Kingpins and Corruption, Targeting Transnational Organized Crime in the Americas. Selena, I'll ask you, what did we get right here? Where did we fall short of appreciating the phenomenon? What's happened since we've issued that report? Give us a bit of a summary.
First, I want to thank AEI and the Federalist Society for focusing on such an important topic that seems like a faraway game, but it actually affects all of our communities here. As Marshall noted, the opioids crisis and the gang issues here in the United States are becoming much closer to home. When we wrote this, which is about a year and a half ago, we started on this project. I think what we did was highlight for the incoming administration the importance of the Western Hemisphere, which had been kind of eclipsed in the last 20 years. And then more importantly, we kind of, in retrospect, we actually divide up the chapters looking at the threat networks. But I have to pessimistically say that in the last 18 months, the threat networks have gotten actually stronger and becoming a more daunting challenge. Mm-hmm. So we just take a look. I just came from Mexico. I'm going to Bogota, Colombia on Thursday. Just the amount of drug trafficking and drug production in terms of heroin and cocaine is unprecedented. And this is globally, not just in the Western Hemisphere. And we've actually seen this, unfortunately, hit the streets of the U.S., where the CDC's just actually proclaimed that in 2017, an average of 196 Americans have died of a drug overdose. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it's coming from over our borders into our communities. What we've also seen is when we've looked at this issue of transnational organized crime, they used to be localized mafias. But we've really seen, and I know my colleagues who I worked and travel quite a bit with, it's gone global. Mm-hmm. And we've actually started to see external actors, which I know the others are going to address. But what we're really frightened about is also not just the drugs that are coming in, but we've also seen how commercialized human smuggling and human trafficking has become, and unfortunately it's been epitomized in the caravan. So for those who don't actually follow the caravan, the inklings and the initiatives of the caravan was to actually protect the migrants themselves from being abused by coyotes or traffickers who would either just extort them or abuse them or turn them into sex slaves. What we're seeing is the same routes are being used coming into the United States and around the region, but what we're seeing is the magnitude, the velocity, and the wealth and the violence accompanying. The other place I've been able to travel to, all the places that Marshall described this whole year, whether we're talking about Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and the tri-border, really we're seeing a transformation of the drug trade. Here in the US, we've actually decreased the consumption of cocaine by 50%, except in the last year. While Colombia continues to produce even more, those drugs have to go somewhere. Mm-hmm. And they're going all over Latin America, but also transiting in order to reach very lucrative markets in Europe, where it's about $100,000 a kilo for cocaine and $180,000 in Australia and New Zealand. Mm-hmm. So this is where you're starting to see others getting involved, whether it's the Chinese mafia or the Russian mafia. The tentacles are getting longer and broader. Mm-hmm. And this idea of also, instead of being specialized just in your country, we're seeing groups like the PCC in Brazil and the Mexican cartels, who've always been pretty global, mm-hmm. go even further afield than just the Western Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the points we made was that a lot of this organized crime and a lot of what's happened in Venezuela and Central America has been all about these global networks optimizing the supply chain of illegal drugs to the North American market. And so people who don't know how transnational organized crime impacts their life, it's the caravan is a symptom of disintegrated institutions, economies that have been undermined. Desperate people are displaced, and they will do whatever they have to do to survive. Set out on a 1,600-mile trek on foot, 2-month trip on foot to try to find a way to make a living, and that's how it impacts us. Doug, I'm going to go to you next. You focused on the evolution of the criminal state. I think Marshall Billingslea did a terrific job sort of explaining how these criminals in Caracas have basically busted out Venezuela, a country, and an oil company, PDVSA, the way gangsters in New York would bust out a pizza joint, except it's a oil-rich country, and they're wrecking the economy and looting it. These criminal states aren't born overnight. I mean, are there signs that we should have seen along the way as Venezuela was falling apart and moving in this direction? As people, it's to say, it sounds too passive, as these criminals took it in that direction, that where we could have made a difference along the way.
I think there are multiple ways, and thank you also to AEI and the Federalist Society for providing this forum. I think there are multiple things that could have been done way earlier, and I think our fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening in this criminalization of these states was that we didn't understand initially that it was a joint criminal enterprise that wasn't Venezuela. It was Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Suriname, all engaged in an ideologically coherent and economically melded fashion to move tens of billions of dollars out and around in a coordinated criminal enterprise that happened to be composed of states. And I think we fundamentally underestimated the size, the magnitude of what we were looking at. I know I did. And I think that we also were extremely tolerant and complacent with the deterioration of the democratic institutions as they went forward in these countries. There were a lot of people in Latin America, in the United States, willing to make excuses for initially Hugo Chavez, then for Daniel Ortega, for Rafael Correa, for Evo Morales. They were doing this, they were doing that. We didn't understand when the FMLN came into power in El Salvador, particularly in the 2014 election, that was sort of the coronation of another element of the criminal enterprise stepping into place. So I think we underestimated and didn't hold firmly enough to our democratic convictions to call out undemocratic behavior when it was clearly visible, documented, and we were constantly making excuses for the groups going forward on this authoritarian path. And that authoritarian path was fundamentally essential to creating the criminal enterprises because you had to criminalize the independent media, you had to criminalize the opposition, you had to criminalize the Catholic Church, you had to criminalize everything that wasn't yourself as a state because the state was the criminal and they had to use these mechanisms to combat what would be normally the rule of law in other institutions. So I think there were multiple indicators, multiple steps that in not understanding what the project was, we let slide a lot of things that could have been taken care of much earlier.
Very well stated, and we'll come back to you a little bit about where those mistakes were made and who some of the authors of this criminal network were who were involved in this. And Manuel, you focused an awful lot, as everyone knows here, on Hezbollah. I'd like you to sort of explain the network in the Americas. What's Hezbollah up to? And specifically, we cited in our report the Ayman Juma case of Hezbollah involved in a very sophisticated international network, to sell drugs in the United States, working with Colombian and Mexican cartels, moving it through Venezuelan territory, moving money into the Lebanese banks, Russian banks. How many more networks are out there like that, and that we need to be concerned of how Iran and Hezbollah projects into our neighborhood?
So first of all, thank you to the organizers for having me today. Very important topic, very timely. The Undersecretary mentioned the tri-border area, which is really one of the areas I focus on the most, and there is a reason for that. The tri-border area after Hong Kong and Miami is the third largest place in terms of commerce and therefore financial flows. And when you read the literature on the topic, you oftentimes encounter catchy headlines such as mullahs in the jungle or such things, because there is this perception that this is a remote place. It's a remote frontier in the periphery of state in Latin America, so there must be some dirt road and some shady traffickers. But the truth is that, unlike a lot of the frontiers in Latin America, this is a place that has a metropolitan area of about 1 million people, divided among 3 countries. Because it has one of the most important and most beautiful tourist attractions in the world, the Iguazu Falls, it has a vastly developed infrastructure of hotels, of money exchanges, of tourist agencies, of transport. It has 3 international airports. Foz do Iguaçu alone handles 4.5 million passengers a year. So this is not a remote outpost in the jungle. This is as developed as it gets in Latin America. And that is precisely why you have so much money laundering and terror financing. Now, as to your question about the networks, Hezbollah leverages its expatriate communities, very much like the Italian mafia used to do and continues to do. One of the DEA agents that used to work on the Project Cassandra was interviewed in the New York Times shortly after the Ayman Juma case and Lebanese-Canadian bank case emerged, and he called them, quote-unquote, Gambinos on steroids. And I think it's very apt because you have an ideology established or founded on a religious worldview that leverages a social clannish structure in order to advance its goals. So wherever you find these communities, you will find Hezbollah investing heavily in the communal and social infrastructure to maintain the loyalty of the community and to put it and to leverage it to its own purposes. Now, in the TBA, as it happens, you have the largest Shia Lebanese community in Latin America, about 30,000 people. It's not a very big community in absolute terms, but it is a significant one, and it is heavily involved in trade. And all of the families that, people who get the Treasury press releases are familiar with, the Jumas, the Tabajas, the Alamin, the long list, the Barakats, the Abdallahs, they're all there. They all have a presence. The Barakats were mentioned before. Well, the Barakats have one of the most senior figures in the Hezbollah power structure, the deputy to Abdallah Safieddin in the business affair components of the external security organization, is a Barakat, and he's the brother of the Barakats who run the Barakat network in the tri-border area. So you have this vast network, and each of these families has a presence, not just in the tri-border, but also in Maicao in Colombia and in Venezuela and maybe in Colón, and very likely in Dearborn, Michigan, and perhaps in Florida, and then further afield in West Africa, in Hong Kong. So the family network, the clannish structure, superimposed to the ideology and the religious commitment are all what Hezbollah leverages. What do? They do 2 things. They provide financial services and logistics to organized crime. Think about Western Union, think about DHL. That's what Hezbollah does for the cartels. The cartels may have control of the territory, but they don't have a global network. Hezbollah provides that. Now, in my native language, we say that appetite grows as you eat. So that's the other thing that they do. Not only do they provide these services, but over time, they have actually figured out that they can become themselves traffickers and do it better than their clients. And so in addition to moving the drugs and laundering the money for their clients, they have started taking payments in kind and trafficking it themselves. They have started supplying the cartels with the precursor chemicals needed. And so they have infested the whole supply chain of organized crime. And in the process, of course, to make it work, they have also penetrated the political systems of their societies and bought off the politicians. And that's the other thing. It's not just the environmental disaster or the lack of the degradation of security and the quality of life. It's also that slowly they're able to buy entire political systems and turn them into our own adversaries and their own allies in perpetuating the system.
Where would you find these Hezbollah cells in the Americas? The bigger operations?
In a lot of places. I mean, as you know, last year there were 2 very prominent publicly announced arrests in New York State. Ali Kourani and Samer El-Debek, 2 Hezbollah operatives. They were not necessarily or primarily engaged in money laundering, although when you read the indictments and the other publicly available documents, you see that they're engaged in also commercial activities. One of them spent significant time in Lebanon as recently as 2011, training on small arms, including RPGs, The other one was a bomb maker, the one who went to Panama and did surveillance on the canal, the U.S. Embassy and the Israeli Embassy. So these are people who were, very high up in the food chain when it comes to organizing terror attacks. And who are the people who are facilitating these two and other such characters in their endeavors? They are the business communities. They are providing the logistics. They're providing the infrastructure. And so wherever you find this high concentration of Shia communities with links back to the motherland, with these prominent clans that are linked through business and through relatives in the clerical establishment and so on, you will find that part of that community is actually beholden to and complicit with Hezbollah and its activities.
Doug, we were chatting before this event and then alluded to it here. Criminal states don't just appear. They evolve, they grow stronger, they expand their operations. As they are able to operate with impunity, they become more bold, link up with others, and become part of a global network. In terms of whether we could have stopped this, Assistant Secretary Billingslea spent a lot of time talking about Gustavo Cabello, who for some reason wasn't sanctioned for years after the U.S. authorities had delivered a package to Treasury to have that decision made. There's an interagency process. You and I have been wondering what has Jose Luis Merino done in life to evade accountability. Kingpin operating in El Salvador in the middle of all these things. FARC negotiations, FARC money laundering operations. He hasn't been sanctioned. Has there been a failure over the years of U.S. officials, bureaucrats, diplomats to appreciate the problem as it was coming down the road and put some roadblocks along the way that might have slowed the evolution of this growing threat?
Well, I think there has been a failure of policy over time based on a failure of understanding of what they were saying. I think when I was at NATO a couple of years ago, General Breedlove was talking about the Russians and saying essentially we don't understand the Russians because we think we're all playing soccer and they're playing rugby. So we think the rules of soccer apply. Somebody does something, we take out a yellow card, a red card, and we think everybody's playing by the same rules, but they're playing an entirely different game and the rules that we think matter don't. I think the Bolivarians were playing something very different from what we thought were the rules of democracy, and we're all in the OAS, and we're all going to do this and that together. And we didn't understand they had fundamentally disengaged from that entire process, and we're playing, rugby on a soccer field with different measures of success and where they were going than what we assumed what the game was. And so I think we took a long time to begin to figure that out. I also think that the enormous lack of attention to the region was fundamentally important because if you recall from 9/11, the last counter-organized crime strategy developed at the end of the Clinton administration, there wasn't a new one until 2011 under the Obama administration, and that was essentially an unfunded mandate. And so you had more than a decade, you had almost 15 years with no new policies in place. And when we got a policy, it was essentially with no resources to go with it, asking people to do more with what they already had. So I think that was an enormous problem. And I think the lack of resources and interest, I think, in talking with people over multiple years about the issues that we're developing in Latin America, the basic feeling was, if it doesn't go boom, we don't care right now because we have Afghanistan, we have Iraq, we have Iran, we have North Korea, we have. And they're right, they have all those things. My counter-argument was when we looked at the number of very high-level Russian delegation visits to Latin America, they out-visited the U.S. by either going to Russia or coming down from the assistant secretary level up. Something in the order of we had done in the period of 6 years that we were looking at or something, I don't remember the exact numbers, we had done something like 17, the Russians had done 170. The Russians have other things to do too, right? They have other priorities, but they found the time to send the president, to send the defense ministers, to the head of the Senate. All these people are visiting Latin America constantly. So the excuse that we don't have the bandwidth I think doesn't wash. And I think that we felt we didn't have the bandwidth to sort of talk ourselves into that. But I think basically it was not understanding the order of magnitude of what we're looking at, and the fact that the entire Venezuela issue and what they were able to finance with Cuban backing and intelligence and then across the region was a gigantic criminal enterprise that had very little to do with anything regarding politics per se, as we were accustomed to seeing. And as they succeeded in shutting down the opposition, and as they succeeded in criminalizing the media, and as they succeeded in doing those things, those voices weren't coming up, and we weren't looking down there. And so I think there were, I don't think anybody set out to make it happen, but I think the cumulative result of that lack of attention over time, that lack of understanding, has really allowed that process to go much further in Latin America than it would have had we been engaged in paying attention.
Mm-hmm. Selena, you surprised me earlier when you said, in point of fact, these networks are stronger now than when they were when we initially looked at the subject. How are they stronger? What do we need to do to be more effective in confronting them?
Well, they're much more nimble, right, than we are. It takes us forever to get anything done in terms of the legislative mandate, the legal framework. So in the defense of the new administration, but more importantly, pursuant to what we were looking at, they have made tremendous strides. First, being able to include transnational criminal organizations on page 11 of the national security strategy is actually a very forward-leaning position. And this idea of creating the task forces, which Attorney General Sessions just announced a couple weeks ago, helps us to focus on these groups that included Hezbollah, which was a good surprise for those of us who follow it, in addition to the Mexican cartels and the gangs. What we still see, though, is that because these groups that are illicit actors, whether they be terrorists, criminals, or proliferators, or traffickers, they're not bound by the same concept of sovereignty and borders and rule of law and human rights that we are. And there's one thing we haven't actually talked about is the rampant corruption throughout the region is what gives these groups the space and the ability to actually co-opt what Doug always refers to as criminalized states, because they're actually providing an alternative state by providing jobs and security. And that's what you see in parts of Central America. The government is not present, but someone's governing them, even though they're not duly elected. So what we're seeing is they move much faster. And while we're down in the tri-border, we're actually doing a ton of training, which is great. But we also see that our counterparts are just as handicapped because it takes so long to get the legislative framework into position in order to then pursue terrorist financiers, money launderers, and criminals, and then more importantly, bring them to justice, and let alone do the extraditions that we all hope to achieve from the U.S. perspective of people who are on the kingpin list. So
in various stages in my career, I've made my way to the tri-border area, and it's interesting, the Brazilians were absolutely convinced themselves that terrorism, talk about terrorism, was contrivance by the United States to get into their business. That they didn't have a terror threat, wasn't a terror problem, neither a drug problem, really. It was someone that was helping somewhere else. Obviously, there are professionals in that government that have always wanted to work with us, that were forward-leaning, different agencies doing better in terms of recognizing the threat and making themselves good partners. But Brazil has been a problem. We had an election recently, as everyone knows, and a new man, Jair Bolsonaro, winning handily that election. He has startled people for a lot of different reasons. And I must say that the commentary is absolutely hysterical in every sense of that word in characterizing the guy. And I think part of it is that the left is rejecting socialism and some of the leaders of that, Lula, some of their favorites. But also that he wants a positive relationship with the United States. What can we expect, and I'll ask anyone who wants to weigh in on this, what can we expect from Brazil? What's the nature of their involvement in this problem? Not as a government, but the fact that these organizations operate in their territory, put money into their banks. What can we expect from the Brazilians? Do you
I'll start. I was just actually there for 2 weeks in September, right when this frenzy of what was going to happen with the elections was taking place. So we're quite optimistic because Bolsonaro is going to bring kind of crime and justice, whether it's mano dura or not, we'll have to see. But we don't pay attention to what's going on to Brazil, but they've actually experienced unprecedented levels of homicide and violence and insecurity, which after the corruption piece was probably the number 2 when they were doing the exit polling in terms of what the average Brazilian voter was kind of protesting. And we're quite optimistic, and you and I were there because I worked with you when we set up the 3+1, which, for those who don't know about this, it was after 9/11. It was to basically unify the efforts of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. +1 is the United States. And we were actually talking about this when we saw our counterparts in September down in Argentina of resuscitating this idea. Because they do realize now that a lot of this convergence that we've written about of terrorism and crime, and then more importantly, the ultra-violence that groups like the PCC and the Red Command, Comando Vermelho, are starting to espouse, and these links that their groups are having with dissidents of the FARC or connections with the Mexican cartels is really quite disturbing. And it's really interesting to see what his first steps are going to be on trying to deal with what they call now criminal insurgency is the very term that they're using now in Rio de Janeiro.
Interesting. Others have something to add on the Brazil front?
Well, the only thing that I would add is, again, with regard to the going back to the tri-border, we tend to look at borders as dividers of jurisdictions and very real things that we take into consideration that states have to respect and factor in. For organized crime and for the terror financing network as well, of course, these are just obstacles to go around. And the tri-border is a perfect example because the Hezbollah networks there play the structural weaknesses or the lack of cooperation or communication between the 3 countries to their own advantage. I mean, the Barakat scheme that was exposed by the Argentinians in July is a perfect example where, 14 individuals were laundering money in the casinos on the Argentinian side, but all of them were really sort of, conducting business in the Paraguayan side while banking in the Brazilian side and living there. And this encapsulates the problem, and it's not just a small problem like that scheme, which was overall worth maybe a few $1 million, but Lava Jato, there is a section of the car wash investigation worth $1.6 billion that went through Paraguay. And the same Paraguayan money exchange house in Ciudad del Este that was used in that scheme is central to a $1.2 billion scheme in Paraguay called Mega Lavado, which connects to Hezbollah because some of that money was being wired to Dearborn, Michigan, to companies that were then being used by Hezbollah for the used car sales in West Africa. So Brazil is critical because it is the largest country, because it is the most important economy, and because its financial system has been suborned for so long by organized crime and by terror finance for their own purposes. And the political class up to now, and therefore the bureaucracy subordinated to it, have been unwilling and unable to go after these networks. Let's hope that this change, of course, will redress that significantly.
Doug, I want to say a 4-letter word here, Cuba. Those of us who watch this very closely, what's happened in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Central America more generally, Colombia with the FARC, the fingerprints of Cuba are all over this. I testified before the House Government Reform and Oversight Committee and said, we finally need to confront this, the fact that Cuba is not really a state. It's a gang. It's a criminal outfit. They, when someone corners them, they all blockade and run up to a UN podium and stand in front of the flag. But it's basically a criminal enterprise, and even the ruination of Venezuela with refugees. It's a feature, not a bug. Driving people out of your country who are going to give you trouble as you try to consolidate a totalitarian government, is part of the Cuba playbook. Why don't you, I don't expect you to be nearly as ideological as that, but give us your sense of what role Cuba's playing in all of this.
Well, I think it's interesting in looking at the history of the Bolivarian movement how influential Cuba was from the beginning. I think the most sort of interesting thing to me is when Evo Morales, and he writes about this himself, goes in 2003 to tell Fidel Castro he wants to start an armed insurgency in Bolivia, and Fidel says, don't do it. You've got to go to elections, rewrite the Constitution, and stay in power forever that way. So clearly the Cubans sort of adapted in ways that were much more forward-thinking than I think we gave them credit for, able to understand the moment for armed revolution had passed. What they worked very hard on is establishing their intelligence structures across the Bolivarian structures. They don't have much else to offer in terms of natural resources and things, but they do have really good intel and counterintel. And if you look at states like Bolivia, where I grew up, all of us knew, kids in my class, upper middle class, if we got in trouble, what was going to happen? If we went to prison, somebody's going to say, oh, Douglas, but my father knows the mother of the colonel and let him out, and I'd be out in 48 hours. It was going to happen. That's just the way the social fabric was done. What the Cubans brought, and we could see this in the early days with Evo Morales, was when they, and it's I think that way across all of these countries, they arrested a governor of Pando called Leopoldo Fernandez. Everybody's like, oh, Leopoldo will be out in a few days because he was Leopoldo Fernandez, right? He was in jail for almost 10 years. Why? Because the Cubans were running the intelligence structure, and they didn't care who you were related to. And I think the value the Cubans brought to their structures, besides the capabilities, the ability to run intelligence structures in countries that had never been able to run these things internally, was the ability to totally disrupt the social networks that gave certain parts of the society levels of protection that were suddenly gone. And it's terrifying. When you're suddenly that exposed, there you are. So I think, and the counterintelligence, the ability to mount manifestations, protest against the government, cause overreactions, et cetera, have been incredibly important. But I think it's also, the enduring myth of the Castro brothers, I think, was also ideologically quite important. And you saw, especially Hugo Chavez's relationship with Fidel, where he considered him his father, and he talked about this endlessly. So I think they were both an inspiration, but an implementer. I don't think Bolivia, Ecuador, particularly as small countries, Venezuela could have gone to the authoritarian model they did without the express Cuban support for their intelligence apparatus to be able to move forward. The ability to run false flag operations, the ability to run front companies, all of those things that they've done so well for many years were suddenly transferred to these countries who had no knowledge of how to do that. Oh, this is really fun. We can do that? Wow, we can have an embassy that runs as a criminal enterprise? How exciting. It hadn't occurred to them before. So I think that it's fundamental to their success in moving down an authoritarian model and their ability to endure. I mean, who has lasted longer than the Castros, right? If anyone knows how to stay in power and get the opposition to do stupid things and divide them and infiltrate them, it's the Cubans. And it's worked like a charm in Venezuela. It's worked like a charm in Bolivia. It's worked like a charm Ecuador, not so much. They finally backed out. But they've had this remarkable success in Nicaragua and keeping things completely divided, destroyed, and that model comes directly from the Castro brothers.
Mm-hmm. And the impression is that, for a lot of people, is that Chavez was sort of seduced by them after his '92 coup, and I think it's pretty apparent he was working for them even before then. And they stage managed right up to killing Hugo Chavez. They stage managed transition and handpicked Nicolas Maduro.
Which probably sorry for now.
and
may not have been the best decision. But yes, and as they're managing their own transition out.
Right, absolutely. And in point of fact, there was someone else who called this out, this Cuban conspiracy a lot earlier than this, a long time ago. It was at the Ibero-American Summit where Paco Flores, the president of El Salvador, confronted Fidel the way no one ever had in public, ever. And I would submit that his imprisonment and his death was the Cubans finishing up some business. I'm going to throw it open to questions. There's in the back here, gentlemen. Please, your name, affiliation, and
I'm glad you don't have your glasses on.
Yeah, I see. You're an inquisitive guy. We got to encourage others.
Well, I hope they elicit good answers. Two questions. One, very quickly. The extent that Iran is pressed on the sanctions and is going to fight back sort of asymmetrically, to what extent are their use of proxies on U.S. soil a risk? You alluded to that, Emmanuel, but you did not state it outright. One. Secondly, is a fundamental reform that allows to address the address of TCOs within the southern or western hemisphere possible, given the level of corruption goes from bottom to top? And finally, just a note, I was accosted by 2 presidential guards under the Chavez area in Caracas, along with Ministry of Justice guys. Later found out that in talking with them, that they had been trained in Cuba, these Venezuelan presidential guards.
Questions?
So the risk, those 2 cases I mentioned clearly highlight it and show that the risk is both on the American soil and on, soft targets such as embassies, such as cultural centers in Latin America. The risk is very much there. And, these networks tend to be acting, for both purposes. We tend to think that, they're just doing money laundering. It's not really terrorism. Some of the money might go to terror financing, but it is not really, people with bombs and guns. The business affair component of Hezbollah is an integral part of its external security operation. It's part of what Europeans call the military wing of Hezbollah. These are not, these are people trained for operational purposes as well as being savvy business people. So the risk is very much there. And the other point is that you have a booming market for drugs, and we haven't addressed it, but part of the reason it's booming is not so much that the crops are so good, it's that we like it so much. If the demand was not so high, it might be a different story, and that's something that policy needs to address, but it's not for today, I guess. So you have increasing opportunities for huge margins of profit. And 2, you have the sanctions pressure you mentioned, which will make, as it did during the years 2010, 2013, reliance on a steady flow of funds from Iran more erratic. So when it comes to Hezbollah, the incentive to actually engage in these activities, more than in the past, is going to go up because they need more money. They can depend on Iran less, and there's a lot more money to be made. And again, you start in the Colombian plateaus with $2,500 a kilo of cocaine, and you end up in Sydney at $250,000 a kilo, and everything in between, 70,000 in Beirut, 120 in the Gulf, 50 to 70 in New York. The margins of profit are huge. And if anyone comes and disrupts, you have the means to actually teach them a lesson. So I anticipate that this problem is going to become worse, and therefore there's a need for a lot more aggressive across-the-board action by the United States. Because once again, we want to get convictions and extraditions, not only sanctions. We want people to be locked up. We want their facilitators to be punished. The corrupt politicians, the bankers, and all of these people. And this cannot continue at the pace of 9 designations a decade, which is what we've had in the tri-border area in Latin America when it comes to Hezbollah.
And can I just say on the corruption, I think that's also the fundamental issue, right? If you want, one of the things that we've been talking about in the policy world is that we have right now very little overlap between the U.S. agenda in Latin America and the Latin American agendas in Latin America, where we're still doing counter-narcotics and illegal migration, and they're worried about homicide rates, violence rates, poverty, instability, et cetera. And the only thing that brings these two agendas together is the commonality that corruption is driving all of those phenomena. And so if we recouch our agenda in terms of corruption, I mean, you look at El Salvador, where you had Tony Saca from Arena confessed to $600 million. Mauricio Funes, FMLN comes along, still $700 million. The current government is probably significantly past that. And so I think it's a non-ideological across-the-border phenomenon where you're now talking simply stealing from Casa Presidencial $600 million. That's not a small thing to be able to do, right? That takes some real foresight and planning to execute. So I think that I think that's the disgust that's driving people out, that is destroying trust in institutions, is making people think they can't live in their countries anymore, they'll do anything to get out, it's driving the violence rates up, et cetera, delegitimizing the state in its totality, and all of those things. So I think if we're going to have an agenda in which most Latin Americans can buy into and that will also help us meet our ends, it has to focus on the corruption issue.
I'm going to take one more question at the risk of going over. Right here, gentleman right here. You have to see if this is as good as Ian's question.
Juan José Dabu from El Salvador, former Minister of Finance of El Salvador. I haven't heard anybody in the two presentations talk about China. And if we look, for example, at the fact that what development agencies or the IMF, or for that matter, assistance and aid from developed countries to developing countries, with this new player in the architecture, with no participation in the Paris Club or other rules and regulations, it becomes, or it could become, a partner for the sort of things that we are talking about here. So, in your opinion, how do you see the role of China in the different elements that each of you have addressed? And is there an opportunity to convert them into an ally of the good instead of the support that they might be providing or contemplating to provide to some not so respectful entities?
So if we take a look at first the above board Chinese investment in Latin America, it's of their own self-interest in terms of expanding markets and then access to resources. So we've known that for a long time. What I've noticed on the people so I teach at the National Defense University, what I've noticed the last 3 or 4 years, many of the students who are applying, who are coming from security and defense institutions, have all seemed to have gone to China. It's a very interesting thing in terms of exchange programs. And we've actually seen, Secretary Manis just did a tour of South America where he talked about rivalries of Russian influence and Chinese influence in Latin America. Now, when I put my terrorist financing and my money laundering hat on, we also know that Chinese banks, and I think Doug's going to address this, are extremely interested in being the financiers and the facilitators for the TCOs in the region. And the piece that I've just finished, I wrote a big piece on the opioids. I call it the new opium wars. We've actually seen that China continues to be the #1 purveyor of precursor chemicals and, more importantly, illicit fentanyl that's killing people on our streets. So these are the pieces, but I'm sure that my colleagues have a lot of comments on this.
I would just say one of the things my research coordinator, Caitlin, is here. We mapped out the ports that China controls in Latin America, and there are in the order of 44 ports where China is across, just in the Western Hemisphere, including 6 in Mexico and elsewhere. And those are the ports where the precursors are primarily coming in for. If you look at El Salvador, what does China do? It comes in and plops down $50 million for La Unión port, which no one else has ever been able to develop. They did no feasibility studies, no environmental studies, and why could no one else develop it? Because there are cross currents, it silts up, you have to dredge it constantly, and it's in the middle of multiple other ports with no significant value in and of itself. So they come in, they want to buy 2 small islands for whatever reason that whatever facilities they want to establish there, and they put down $50 million in a port which has no utility to them in terms of economic benefit. Now, It may have other utility to them, but it's not. And they bought up land around Puerto Corsain, which is just down the road, which is a port controlled by the FMLN, Jose Luis Merino, for their smuggling activities. So you have to wonder what the end game is there. None of it's good, I would argue, in the case of your country, that very little of it is going to be beneficial. This idea that you're going to create tens of thousands of jobs has never happened. If you look at Brazil now, which is deeply sorry for its relationship with China because it brought none of the benefits and a massive debt with it, you're going to, I think there's a lesson to be learned there. I think that the FMLN in particular, I think the Sandinistas will be the next to jump, are very interested in survival. And what the Chinese will offer them is short-term survival with a lot of money and access to banks and access to other things that will allow them to carry out criminal activities will be much more difficult for the United States to monitor, and bring some short-term benefit and a lot of long-term grief to the countries where they are.
Well, I'm going to stop right there, but thank you very much for your terrific presentations. Before we end this panel, I just wanted to acknowledge that much of the work on our initial report and then putting this three-panel, if you include Mr. Billingslea's contribution, putting this together is Andres Martinez Fernandez, who is a colleague of mine, and I wanted to make sure that he was recognized. We're going to end this panel, take a few minutes to bring together a panel that my colleague Jim Dunlap from the Federalist Society will chair, along with representatives from the Justice Department, former ambassador to Venezuela, and other. Bill Brownfield will also be on that panel. So please stay where you are, please, for this next panel. Let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists here for their contribution.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well done.
We on? I think we'll get started with our second panel. This is Welby, Patrick Clay, and so 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. They tell me it is. Yeah, it should be fine. Are we all set?
I just want to pay homage, very briefly, homage.
You can follow.
All right, welcome to our second panel of the afternoon at our Dismantling Transnational Organized Crime Networks in the Americas. I'm Jim Dunlop. I'm here today representing the Federalist Society. I'm also a lawyer in private practice. I practice white-collar criminal defense of companies and executives who do business in Latin America. And so my clients encounter these problems and many others in the way of corruption and rule of law issues there. I'm joined today, though, by a very distinguished panel from whom I'm excited to learn, starting on my right with Welby Lehman, who's a Senior Director of Global Government Affairs at Walmart. He has prior federal experience as trade counsel to the House Ways and Means Committee, where he led the passage of the U.S.-Colombia Trade Agreement, and at the U.S. Treasury, where he worked on issuance of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States regulations. So this is Welby Lehman. Next to him from the Justice Department is Patrick Hovakimian, who's currently Associate Deputy Attorney General at the United States Department of Justice and the department's first Director of Counter-Transnational Organized Crime. He previously served as an Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of California. To his right is Clay Fuller, a Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow here at AEI, researching authoritarian governance, illicit finance, and corruption. He's also a published author of multiple journal articles and opinion pieces, in addition to having testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Helsinki Commission on issues of illicit finance and trade. And finally, at far stage right is William Brownfield, currently a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Chile, also our Ambassador to Venezuela and Colombia, and he served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement from 2011 to just last year, 2017. I'm honored to be here with these panelists today. I'm not speaking for my law firm or for the Federalist Society when I ask questions or make comments on what they have to say. I would like to, I also thank the American Enterprise Institute for hosting this panel and this event and having me here today. I want to start, Mr. Hovakimian, with you so that you can talk to us about the task force, which was just formed 2 weeks ago, or announced 2 weeks ago by Attorney General Sessions, and tell us what it's about and what its goals are and what you intend to do.
Jim, I'm happy to. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to AEI. I remember fondly being an intern in Washington many, many years ago and being in a different, decidedly less palatial space than this, but nevertheless always enjoying my time at AEI. And I've been a Federalist Society member since about day one of law school, so it's particularly special for me to be here today, so thank you. The Attorney General announced a few weeks ago, as you mentioned, a transnational organized crime strike force, a task force. I get strike forces and task forces mixed up. We don't know the difference really, but this one is a task force. He designated 5 priorities: the Sinaloa cartel, CJNG, Clan del Golfo, Lebanese Hezbollah, and one other one, and said, these are the priorities of the administration, and we're going after them full bore. The task force came out of DOJ's singular response. That's distinct from our whole of government response, which I'll get into in a minute. It came out of our singular response to the president's executive order that was issued last February. It was one of the earlier executive orders of the administration, and as all of you know, it was designated towards fighting transnational organized crime. The priority and emphasis on this comes from the top. It comes from the White House. The Attorney General has been strong on this for a career. He designated these 5 groups and established this task force, and that's just the latest step we're taking to fight these groups. Each subcommittee, so each group, will be targeted by a subcommittee of federal prosecutors, OCDF folks, and law enforcement agents around the country. Those people have, among them, decades of experience in fighting these groups. They've prosecuted and put away probably hundreds of these members, and they are locked and ready to go. They've been working on interim progress over the course of the last 2 weeks. The Attorney General in his memo directed us to report back to him in 90 days as to the status of the task force's efforts against these 5 groups. So we anticipate those reports will be fulsome. They will include ways to target these groups that implicate not just law enforcement actions and prosecutions, but also a more sort of like totalistic whole of government approach, and we anticipate that those recommendations will be implemented for the rest of the administration. So in addition to what DOJ is doing on its own, and that's this task force that the Attorney General announced, we're also actively partnering with our interagency partners throughout the federal government to fight transnational organized crime. There's this entity called the TMWIG, the Threat Mitigation Working Group. As we go on today, you'll hear about 19 other acronyms from me. I may not remember to define them all, but anyway, that's what would government be without 19 acronyms in a 30-minute speech. The TMWIG is comprised of DOJ, state, ODNI, DOD, Treasury, and DHS. They are our law enforcement partners, they're our diplomatic partners, they're our military partners, and this is the crux of our whole of government approach to fighting transnational organized crime. DOJ is actively involved in the steering committee for TMWIG. We are working with our interagency partners to come up with plans as to how best to implement the President's executive order from February of last year. We meet very regularly. It's bringing to bear the full resources of the federal government. That's financial when it comes to OFAC and FinCEN. It's diplomatic when it comes to state. It is the global reach of the Defense Department and the Pentagon are implicated here also. INL at state is very intimately involved, and of course our agency partners at DHS vis-a-vis the Coast Guard and other agencies are very intimately involved as well. So those are the broad strokes. That's what DOJ is doing on its own, and that's what DOJ is doing with its interagency partners. We anticipate ratcheting the fight up in the months and years to come. DOJ established this counter-transnational organized crime directorate, of which I am now the head of. I'm looking forward to diving in full steam ahead, and this is a priority for the administration. There's sort of no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It comes from the top. It comes from the president. The Attorney General is 100% committed to this effort, and DOJ is committed to fighting transnational organized crime.
And obviously, it doesn't spring from whole cloth. I mean, the prior administration had its CTOC strategy. The Department of Justice has long been involved in the fight. And so is it a sort of a reorganization of priorities and tools within the department? And can you comment on kind of which tools you think will provide the uplift for DOJ in the fight?
Yeah.
Compared especially to the Treasury tools that we talked about earlier.
Yes. I think it's not so much a reorganization as it is just sort of a rejiggering of priorities. We're saying here are 5 groups. They have been designated as top priorities for various reasons, for their global reach, in the case of Hezbollah, for being particularly violent, for being, for lack of a better term, on the upswing and kind of on the ascent, and we want to stop it before they get up there. So for various reasons, these groups have been designated priorities. Now, we're also in a great position to fight them. We have DEA and FBI engaged actively on this. We have our law enforcement partners actively engaged. And these groups that have been designated as priorities are going to be focused on by teams of prosecutors around the country. And that's really the innovation to the AG's task force, I think, Jim, is the level of coordination. Because right now, like, let's say you're an AUSA in LA and you're doing, you have a Hezbollah case, and you're an AUSA in Brooklyn and you have a Hezbollah case. Chances are you might know one another because you go to the same conferences, you go to the same meetings, you might be on a listserv or something. But what this does, this task force, is it formalizes the commitment to working across offices, even within DOJ, looping in all of our law enforcement agencies, DEA, FBI, and others, and having really a true subcommittee that, it's not like we sit around a table and have plaques and everyone, we take roll and it's Robert's Rules of Order. But at the same time, it is pretty formal. It's like we're saying, here is our team that is dedicated to fighting this one group. And that's really the innovation, I think, is it draws upon the different parts of the government and also the different parts of DOJ and puts everyone at the table together.
What about statutory tools or novel or unique uses or just increased uses of legislation, criminal legislation that's available, such as the Kingpin statute, such as Section 315 of the Patriot Act?
Yeah, those are powerful tools that are available to U.S. law enforcement. We've used them in the past, as has been publicly reported in 2015. The Kingpin statute was used to seize a very nice hotel on the west coast of Mexico that was tied up with one of these cartels. I anticipate we will continue to use statutes like that. I anticipate that, without getting into anything that's law enforcement sensitive in any meaningful way, I anticipate potentially an uptick or an increase in using these statutes as leverage as part of our holistic fight against TCOs.
And we'll get into a little of this, I think, as we talk further about whether there are areas in which, for example, we can improve our MLATs with certain countries in the region, and whether we can talk about some specific designations or targeting of actual government officials in ways that we haven't done before, because that's a sensitive area and where the threshold is for that. But at this point, one question I have in terms of the designations that Justice has made, a lot of cartels and Hezbollah. How much of the fight does Justice see as domestic, meaning taking place by the department in the U.S. as opposed to coordinating within the region and with other regional governments?
It's hard to put a number on it, Jim, but I would say it's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I mean, things that happen overseas affect us here in the U.S., and things that happen here on the streets. I mean, I used to be a prosecutor in San Diego. We have a terrible gang problem in northern San Diego County, and these people are pushing drugs that the cartels are importing through the Tijuana-San Diego corridor, and it's causing real problems, and it's a cycle. I mean, things that happen domestically in the U.S. empower the cartels, as we all know, and the cartels' practices on the south side and elsewhere, really directly contribute to some of the harms that we feel here in the U.S. So I anticipate the department will continue to use the statutory tools available to us, RICO and otherwise, to go after things that we might just consider sort of domestic street gangs, if you want to call them that. But at the same time, having been a prosecutor and having helped build cases from the inside out, all of this is connected. It's all connected. There's people who are they never leave their block in LA who are connected and tied up with shot callers on the south side. All of this is tied together, and we have powerful law enforcement tools at our disposal to fight it. That's part of the message here. Part of the message, candidly, is this government cares about this issue. This government, under the direction of the President and the Attorney General, are going after transnational criminal organizations, whether they're operating here or across the border. This is a priority for the administration, and DOJ is at the forefront of it.
Thank you. Well, on our theme of this panel of really drilling down into the toolkit and seeing whether it's adequate and where the gaps might be, I want to turn to Clay Fuller, because I know you've done a lot of analysis, Clay, of transnational criminal organizations, the sort of authoritarian aspect that they take on in some countries like Venezuela, and sanctions and other tools, and essentially a gap analysis. Do you want to comment on sort of the state of play, the adequacy of what you've heard today from Secretary Billingslea and from Mr. Hovakimian, and generally in this fight?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I just wanted to give a premise that I don't come from a policy background or a law enforcement background. I come from more of an academic background. So I'm going to take 3 minutes to give you a big picture overview of what's going on and how I see it. First, I became an academic because I don't like authority that much. This is a big surprise, but I don't like anarchy either, because anarchy is another type of dictatorship. So I spent about 10 years studying modern authoritarian governance around the world. This is 21st century ways of maintaining monopolies on political control within governments in the internet and post-Cold War era. And so what I see when I look around with the trends of that is that in the post-Cold War era, we've integrated with authoritarian countries all around the world, with our markets, with the internet, throughout everything. And this has had great positive effects for a lot of people all around the world, and has brought a lot of people up out of poverty, has made a lot of people a lot of wealth, and created a lot of development out there. But what's happened in authoritarian regimes around the world during that is they've captured this wealth, and they've used it to create things like totalitarian surveillance states. They're building missile systems. They're building nuclear weapons. They're building things to threaten us in the West and in the United States. And so this has created, I think, the necessary actions that U.S. law enforcement and government has taken in sanctions. I think we're doing the right thing by pushing back on Venezuela, by pushing back on China, by pushing back on Russia, by pushing back on Iran, by pushing back on North Korea. We're taking the right actions, but what's happened is if you look at this development in the authoritarian countries around the world in the post-Cold War era and think of it as a balloon, what the sanctions are doing is they're squeezing that balloon. And it's forcing that wealth and that capital to move in between authoritarian states around the world and move into the United States and Western countries that have strong rule of law protections. Right, so this creates cover for transnational criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, who what we see now is that terrorist organizations are contracting with transnational criminal organizations, and criminal organizations are contracting with terrorist organizations for things that they don't know how to do each other. And what they're doing is they're hiding under the opacity and the lack of transparency in authoritarian governments and the corruption in authoritarian governments around the world in order to act with impunity around there while creating structures that then move that money in, move that value into the United States and around there. So we've squeezed this balloon. We've forced them in to work together. This is why Venezuela is pushing money out through obscure Russian banks and creating the ironic sovereign cryptocurrencies that doesn't really make much sense to me as an academic. But thinking of that, the money's being squeezed into the United States. I really like the America First approach. I love America, but I see it a little bit differently. Where I think we need to be focusing on America, right, and focusing on catching where this money is coming in and exposing it and stopping it there. And I think this is done through, like we've heard before, beneficial ownership, transparency, working on what that FATF calls DNFPBs, or designated non-financial sectors and businesses, to be lawyers, realtors, accountants, corporate service providers. We need to focus on how this money is coming in, looking at it, taking trade-based money laundering seriously, getting to transparency, better here to know what's going on at home. So this is how we lead the rest of the world, as Mr. Billingslea talked about, inspiring other Central American countries and Mexico to create their own sanctions regimes that are able to go after these things and building the rule of law. But we need to recognize the sort of larger trend here. So terrorists and transnational criminal organizations have an infinite supply of drugs, violence, and criminals. Right? There's an infinite supply out there, and the question is, how do you stop the supply of something that's infinite? And the answer really is that you can't, but you can mitigate it, and you mitigate it by stopping the ways in which they're able to profit off of it. And so if you can stop and capture the ways that they profit off of it, then you can mitigate the threats that they pose.
And so what particular solutions would you propose for stopping the ways that they profit off of it?
Well, specifically, if you look at, since we're with FATF, there's 40 recommendations with FATF for AML, anti-money laundering, financing of terrorism. I believe the U.S. is compliant on every single one of them. This is done through peer review of the 37 member countries of the organization. We're compliant on all of them but 22, 23, 24, and 28, which all have to do with beneficial ownership, transparency, and these lawyers, realtors, accountants, and corporate service providers or company formation agents. So there is something we can do right there. Bringing cryptocurrencies into it is a really good thing to do as well with the FATF recommendations, because this is used as a tool to sort of teach and share our best practices with the rest of the world, because we are really good at what we do in the United States. Our law enforcement is great at what it does. But the other one to bring into it is taking trade-based money laundering seriously. So trade-based money laundering is sort of this enigmatized thing where what Hezbollah and others do, they'll obscure the value of trade-based goods by misinvoicing, mislabeling, over-invoicing, under-invoicing, in order to transfer value around the world in ways that are largely undetectable. And this is just happening right underneath our noses. They're buying up large volumes of electronics in China and then shipping them back to Mexico or Central America, and then up through the border, and then being sold to anonymously owned subsidiaries in the United States, formed in Delaware or somewhere, and then distributing those profits and using it to smuggle cigarettes from North Carolina up to New York, and connecting into this whole area. And we need to get a good handle. I think FATF needs to come up with a solid definition of what trade-based money laundering is and what the private sector should do about it. And the other part of it is with the private sector, we've sort of unduly put the burden on banks, where I think they're doing a great job at what they're doing, but with the CDD rule from Treasury that we've talked about here at Customer Due Diligence, this sort of unfairly sort of singles out banks, which they should do this, and they're doing a great job with it. But criminals are smart, like we've talked about before, and these TCOs and the terrorist groups they're 2 steps ahead, and they're ahead of the CDD rule, and what they're doing is they're moving through anonymous shell companies, they're buying real estate, they are hiring accountants to create these types of structures that are not discoverable right now.
Well, and this is something I've wondered about, if whether putting the onus on banks and on financial institutions to essentially be the roadblock is putting too much onus in one place and even having anti-competitive effects for those institutions because they're being asked to do too much. Now, you mentioned the private sector, and Welby, I know obviously you're here with us from Walmart today, and you've thought about this, and you've thought about, and I was very pleased to hear Doug, the secretary rather, say that the private sector was the first line of defense. And he didn't really follow up on that, but I think that's, other than in the way that you have, Mr. Fuller, but let's talk about that. How is the private sector the first line of defense? If so, how? And I think hearing Secretary Billingslea say that was the first time I'd heard it put that way. Usually I hear it put rather pejoratively in terms of the private sector's interaction on this issue in the region. So what can you tell us?
Well, can I start with a trick question? Is Walmart's top competitor in Latin America Carrefour or Cencosud? Well, it's neither. It's transnational criminal organizations. Smuggling operations. Let's just, for almost all of my comments, I'd like to just home in on Guatemala, just as sort of the case, right? Think about the Chiapas-Guatemala border and the smuggling that's going on across it. Or think about the La Línea corruption scandal in Guatemala that brought down the last Guatemalan president. Well, it was a bribery scandal to get things from the ports through customs. Well, who is that? It's an organization that is competing with us. We're going to beat the informal economy. That's what Walmart does. We have a formalizing role. And it's not just us. The formal economy is an example of what those of you who talk on the Hill and understand sort of what sells trade agreements and so forth, it's an example of the United States government, the United States private sector partnering together on trade and investment in order to raise standards, right? That's what we do. And that formalizing role is, I think, the core of what Walmart and other companies like us do. We heard also in the first panel that corruption, from Selena and from others, that corruption, and from Douglas, is the sort of facilitator of and the cover for all of the rest of this illicit activity within networks. And I would like to sort of focus especially on what I think is a misperception about the private sector's role, in that looking, for example, again at Guatemala, a lot of work being done by the U.S. government in an all-of-government sort of way, but especially through state INL and others. In some ways, what you see is the presumption that the private sector has a role sort of on Prosperity Day in our now annual summits in which we talk about how to improve rule of law and thus weaken transnational criminal organizations in Guatemala and elsewhere. And then the public sector has a role on Security Day. First of all, there's a problem there in that the private sector cannot adequately play its role on Prosperity Day unless it also has a role in Security Day. And second of all, the public sector needs the private sector in order to succeed in the creation of rule of law. Why is that? It's in part because rule of law, which is an antidote to this sort of cover and facilitation problem of corruption for transnational criminal organizations, is a Douglas North-style three-part institution. So it includes enforcement authorities, but man does not live by prosecution alone in this context. We need also those who can contribute the informal cultural norms that Douglas North especially emphasized in his work on what builds an institution. And that is disproportionately done by the private sector because it is through both social and economic incentives that one develops cultural norms. So thinking specifically about that, I want to tell you a very sad story. So the first part is something you probably already know, so I'm going to gloss over it really quickly. Walmart has, in Guatemala, 1,000 suppliers, many of them developed with USAID. USAID projects in which we worked closely with USAID and with small and medium-sized enterprises in order to build this huge network, which includes in the Wild West, so to speak, in Petén and so forth, areas that are highly informal and where that informality and corrupt culture facilitates these networks. We also have 250 stores with over 13,000 employees. So that network is the first opportunity for many Guatemalans, whether in direct employment or in self-employment and then selling to Walmart, or in the consumption space, to participate in the formal economy and opt against this whole participation in illicit networks. That's a story that you guys probably all know. What you probably don't know is that one of the heroes of the rule of law work in Guatemala, the former Attorney General Telma Aldana, who is a celebrated figure in the U.S. government's efforts to address these networks, told Walmart, this is a direct quote, "Can I give you some unsolicited advice? Don't buy from any Guatemalan companies. Forget that whole network." Why? Because there is a fundamental misunderstanding about the intersection between Security Day and Prosperity Day. The prosecutors in Guatemala and the U.S. government will fail at their efforts to build the institution, the three-part institution of rule of law, until what Telma Aldana said finally becomes more clearly an error in people's minds. The reason she's saying that is because she thinks that that network exposes us to serious legal risk, because invariably, if you work with 1,000 companies, somewhere out there you're going to work with some crooks. This goes back to your question then. I mean, it's made a big circle to get back to you, but where you raised the question of, do we put all the onus on the banks? I think the solution is in part to understand what high standard compliance looks like. It doesn't look like perfection. It looks like cooperation. And so the reason that Aldana is wrong when she tells us to stop working with buying from Guatemalan companies is, of course, in part because unless we buy from those Guatemalan companies, the formalization role won't expand, and ultimately prosecutors just can't prosecute enough people. So they need our role to complement theirs. But it's also because of more than that. It's also that we have a specific, it's not just our jobs and our investment that make a difference. It is our participation in the act of building rule of law itself through high compliance standards and through cooperation with the government on cases that implicate us, in cases that implicate others. It's in that context that one needs to understand the private sector as an ally in this effort, such that if you have a business like ours that has 1,000 suppliers and it turns out that there are 5 crooks among those 1,000, which is a pretty good batting average, then instead of doing what's actually happening in Guatemala, which is going after all of the formal businesses, you instead recognize those formal businesses as the distributors of formalization, cooperate with them, help us to root out the bad apples, and continue pushing out proper formalization to others.
We've heard, I think, some pretty strong expressions today from Treasury and from Justice and about the private sector of each component's role in the fight against transnational organized crime in the Americas. Ambassador Brownfield, you have a unique position of having represented the United States in 3 countries in the region and having had to deal with both the problems and the mishmash of agencies that have been talking with us today and the private sector in addressing the problem and watching how it gets addressed. And I'm wondering if you can give us your own gap analysis of where this fight might be improved among the agencies, and maybe talk a little bit about the particular role of foreign policy in the region in improving America's stand in this fight.
By golly, I think I can. And in fact, I'd be delighted to do so. By the way, Dr. Fuller noted that he brought you kind of the background of an academic. I bring you the background of a West Texas farming family. And the cotton farmers of America want me to say the following, which, by the way, I've been saying for about 5 years. Ladies and gents, it is my contention that the United States government is currently quite well organized for dealing with 2 facets of transnational organized crime: terrorism and counterterrorism, drugs and counter-narcotics. I don't say we've been successful in absolute terms. I say we are well organized. People know who's in charge, what the process is, how things are decided, and who controls the assets and the resources. In between, or all around those 2 specific parts of the problem set, is a nearly infinite number of other forms of transnational organized crime. Migrant smuggling, trafficking in persons, illegal mining, illegal logging, firearms, you name it, it's out there. Cyber, financial crime, wildlife trafficking, for God's sake, and another 600 or so. My view is we have made progress. It is incremental. It is small steps. We are better today than we started when we discovered transnational organized crime about 5 or 6 years ago. But we still need to come to grips with a basic structure that has 4 core elements. A strategy, not a detailed point-by-point, this is the route to success strategy, but something that allows everyone involved to say, yes, our equities are incorporated in this, and we can work with our colleagues on the basis of this strategy. Second, we need authorities. There are plenty of authorities out there. You just heard a good number of them from the position of the Department of Justice. In a sense, what we need to do is have an opportunity collectively to express our views to the maker of authorities in the United States government, that is the Article I branch of government, the United States Congress, in terms of what authorities does the executive branch as a whole believe it needs to address this larger issue of transnational organized crime. Third is organization. Now, it could be something as simple as counter-narcotics, a single-issue agency that's in charge. It's called DEA. Wouldn't work at all in this context, but that's the ultimate of simplicity. It could be something almost as simple, counter-terrorism, where if it's a domestic operation, it's FBI. If it's outside of the United States of America, it's Department of Defense. That's simple. Everyone can basically understand that. It also will not work for transnational organized crime. What we need is a structure that everyone understands and agrees to and is implemented by an executive order by the head of the Article 2 branch of government, the President of the United States. And fourth and finally, we need resources clearly directed at this problem. They're out there, by the way. It is not that we are resource short, but in many ways the resources are stovepiped, and of course, agencies are reluctant, I know, I ran one for 7 years, to share their resources on demand with others without understanding what their role is. So at the end of the day, I would suggest it is strategy, authorities, organization, resources. Now, where are we right now? I would, having given you that blistering and somewhat negative in terms of suggesting that we haven't quite gotten across the goal line yet, I will say I think we're far better positioned now than we were when we started down this road, which I would say was around 2011, 2012, when the first of the executive orders came out. And in fact, I think this administration first came out guns blazing with one of the very first executive orders on the issue of transnational organized crime. The good news is everyone paid attention to the fact that this is a priority. The bad news is the early executive orders tend to be those that have not enjoyed the maximum amount of thinking, preparation, and so forth. And in fact, those who have to implement them are doing a certain amount of catch-up as they work their way through. But I'll throw out some examples of things that work well. Extradition works exceptionally well. May I tell you why? Because it scares I'm a former diplomat, it scares the bejesus out of those who are subject to extradition. In the glorious days of the great cartels in Colombia in the 1990s, the favorite expression of the Pablo Escobars of the world were mejor una tumba en Colombia que una celda en los Estados Unidos. Better to lie in a tomb in Colombia than in a jail cell in the United States. That scares them. That actually has them concerned. Extradition treaties, actually, we don't need to worry so much about that. Every MLAT, in my humble opinion, this is INL speaking, I know I'm in your territory, but every MLAT that is out there has language in it that to all intents and purposes gives you a de facto extradition treaty, if not a de jure extradition treaty. We've got the negatives that we can pound them with, and that's what sanctions are all about, ladies and gentlemen, and they can hurt. I predict that in the course of maybe this decade, if not certainly by the next decade, it is going to bring down sanctions are going to bring down a criminal government in our hemisphere, a government that I say is not just a narco state, it's a mafia state because it goes well beyond drugs, and I'm referring to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. There are positive weapons that we have at our disposition as well, however, and let us not forget them. The International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement Act appropriates somewhere between $1.2 and $1.5 billion a year. This is positive stuff that we can lay out to foreign governments, police, prosecutors, courts, prison systems, and say, you get these benefits if, in fact, you will perform these particular actions. This actually helps the criminal justice community and the law enforcement community in order to have something other than a hammer to beat governments over the head with in order to do the right thing. At the end of the day, I start negative. I still think we got some work to do, but I believe we're far better positioned now than we were, let's say, when I came into my INL job in January of 2011.
And so you talked about some of the tools, and you talked about the need for strategy, and you talked about the things that we can do with governments in the region other than to beat them over the head and to take and bring to their attention. Whose job is that? Because as I read the executive order, it's very enforcement focused and not really focused on making it or elevating it as a matter of foreign policy. And I wonder if you think that it's been at a sufficient level within the State Department as a matter of foreign policy.
Yep. I'm going to give you an answer that may surprise you, certainly will surprise the gentleman in the middle. And for you State Department guys, and I see you, I know you're here, stand by to gasp. My own view is, and it always has been my view, that combating transnational organized crime The lead responsibility goes to the law enforcement and criminal justice community.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
The C in TOC is the same as the C in criminal justice. Now, at the end of the day, they are the ones who are saying this is our objective in terms of what we are trying to accomplish. It must obviously work in tandem with our foreign policy and foreign relations objectives, because it is foreign, it is international, it is outside of the United States of America. It must tie into our financial system and those who manage our financial systems, not to mention our economic, commercial, and trade systems, or, believe it or not, our health and human services systems, who are responsible, in a sense, for how we manage those drugs that are illicit, or, in fact, those drugs that have been abused in the United States of America. But you can't have everyone running the policy and setting the priorities, which is why under Bill Brownfield's DREAM formula, where we have worked our way through first strategy and then through authorities, we get to organization. We're able to come up with a structure that, one, allows the criminal justice community to say, this is our targeted or our objective, and then the other communities are able to say, this is where it must fit into how we do things. And what is the way to ensure, ladies and gentlemen, that it is done correctly, at least on a country-by-country basis? It is this. In every country in the world, with the exception, I think, of maybe 2 or 3, there is a little tiny United States government. It is located inside the United States Embassy. And in that embassy is a little mini President of the United States. You can recognize him or her because he or she has received a letter from the President of the United States, which says, congrats, you're my ambassador. Every element of the United States government in your country reports to you. Don't screw it up. Have a nice day. Love, the President. So to a very considerable extent, there is a human, at least in each individual country, who is in a position to say, we'll do this, we won't do that. Now, at the end of the day, if that human exceeds his or her authorities, he or she will undoubtedly hear from Washington in a variety of headquarters. But this, from my perspective, is the basis by which we are relatively confident that things won't go wildly off track, unless, of course, and God knows this almost never happens, Dr. Fitzpatrick, but unless we have a moron as ambassador, and if that happens, all bets are off.
Well, I think we should give our Associate Deputy Attorney General a chance to react, and also maybe follow up.
What can he complain about?
Well, that's quite something.
It occurs to me you may think some of this is already underway.
I think some of it is already underway, and if I may have the chance now to say something that might, I don't know, it might surprise our diplomatic colleagues on stage and in the audience. I do view the issue and as primarily an enforcement issue. We have to, at some level, dismantle these networks, these organizations, and take them down. But it is incredibly, incredibly important and, strictly speaking, necessary. I really firmly believe that. It is necessary to bring all tools available to us to this fight. And a critical part of that is diplomacy. It is political will. It's engendering a climate in countries where these folks operate that says this isn't okay, that we're going to stand up to it. Corruption, someone mentioned. I was a corruption prosecutor before taking on these manager roles. I prosecuted corruption all over Southeast Asia, things connected to Thailand, the Philippines, the Western Pacific. It is the number one cause of all of this. When you have government officials who say, I have an office, I'm going to look the other way, or when they say, I'm going to take your money and I'm going to do something for you and I'm going to enable all this to go on, when that happens, the war is already lost. And I'm telling you, as a prosecutor, as someone who's done these investigations and cases for years, you can't just fight that with law enforcement. You just can't. That might be a shocking statement to some of our diplomatic friends. But you just can't. That's why the Department of Justice has OPDAT. the overseas prosecutorial development crew that goes over to different countries and helps train prosecutors and helps train judges sometimes in other countries. That's why we have delegations come to the United States. I'm going to go speak to a delegation of Mexican judges up in New York City next month. I was down in Mexico visiting with our colleagues down there at Post and also some of our counterparts in the Mexican government about rule of law issues. And INL was intimately involved, and state was nothing but hospitable to us. And they've been a great partner in the whole of government approach. But it is so critical to bring to bear every tool and every resource we have to this fight, because if what we do is just indict a bunch of people based on a wire we have up here in the U.S., and they're indicted and they're living out in wherever, and we never see them, what good is that? It's no good. And if we indict a bunch of people, get them here somehow through an extradition process that does actually work pretty well, and imprison those people, but we haven't worked with state, we haven't worked with our other partners, we haven't worked with local governments to ensure that an environment exists where new organizations don't just pop up immediately. Look, I'm not naive. They'll pop up potentially at some point, but we can slow it down. We can do things. If we haven't built that environment, that geopolitical environment, well, then what good is having a bunch of people indicted and imprisoned in the United States?
Yes, yeah. I think overseas prosecution is difficult. MLATs are great tools, but they move at the speed of the host country, right? So that's very difficult, mutual legal assistance treaties. In the corruption space, which is a space I work in quite a bit, it's very difficult for the United States to always establish its authority, its jurisdiction, and then you end up in diplomatic issues and issues of foreign relations when you start to talk about turning those tools against leaders of foreign governments. But when you have a state, such as the state Ambassador Brownfield described in Venezuela, is there a threshold over which you start to look at those tools? You start to look at Section 315 of the Patriot Act, which allows turning what we think of as FCPA or anti-corruption activities into, money laundering offenses, into prosecutable corruption offenses.
Right.
And what about seizure authority? It's one thing to block, and Treasury, and we've heard today great discussion of Treasury's ability to block and ability to identify networks. It's another thing to take the assets and deprive them, and that's really a Justice Department function. Yeah. How can we better use that, or should we be using it more? Do you plan to?
So, as you mentioned, Section 315 of the Patriot Act adds to the specified unlawful activity under the money laundering statutes, public corruption offenses, including those taking place overseas, broadly speaking. It's a valuable tool. It's a powerful statute. It's something that the department has used in the past. It's something that our past use will continue. We've used the Kingpin designation. We've worked with OFAC. We've worked with FinCEN, and I anticipate these trends as part of the government's overall emphasis on taking down these networks to continue.
Great. I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. Yes?
Thank you very much. Mike Jajits, George Mason University. The leitmotif of this discussion has been that corruption is really the center of gravity for terrorism, drug trafficking, et cetera. And the point made by the representative from Walmart gets to the solution, which is rule of law. And in particular, in Guatemala, Thelma Aldana is the Attorney General, but she's been supported by the Commission to Combat Impunity in Guatemala, CICIG. The president, when CICIG and Thelma Aldana went after his corruption that got him into office, like the Lava Jato scandal in Brazil, is now trying to dismantle CICIG, won't allow Ivan Velasquez, the head of CICIG, to return to run the organization. I have not heard the Trump administration condemn that. And I think you made the point. We need to stand up to corruption and condemn it. Can we expect to hear the Trump administration side with the rule of law in CICIG in Guatemala?
Well, I suppose that was directed towards me. I'm the only Trump administration official up
here.
I'm former. By all means, sir. You want to take that one?
I'm an academic.
No, look, the attitude and the pace is set at the very top. The president is 100% committed to enforcing the law as it's written and upholding the rule of law. We have an attorney general who has been a champion for the rule of law his entire career, and we anticipate that the Department of Justice will continue in that tradition.
If I could add 30 seconds to this. I ran INL in the State Department for 7 years, and INL was the recipient of the earmarked funding from the United States Congress every year to support CSIG. I can tell you that the current president of Guatemala is not the first president of Guatemala to turn against CSIG. I had conversations with his two predecessors at various times over the last 8 years, each time saying, you may like it, you may dislike it, the money if the money is to be spent, it is going to be spent on supporting CSIG. Two presidents basically accepted that. They held their breath and proceeded. It's a work in progress in terms of this one.
Well, go ahead. You and I sat with Thelma down at the American Society. I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, again, to go back to this idea of Douglas North and the building of an institution, right? I mean, the United States government has a lot of experience with building institutions inadequately in Latin America. So let's take, let's say, the effort to build intellectual property rights in Latin America. We brought in bulldozers, spent all of our money through embassies on enforcement. In fact, sometimes put countries on the Special 301 watch list because they weren't putting all their money, all their IPR budget into enforcement, and it didn't work. Then we started building out the rest of the institution of intellectual property, including taking seriously that you have to invest in cultural norms. And then it started grabbing hold because people had incentives. The work of INL has been entirely focused on enforcement, as is its responsibility, but that shows why INL is not adequate. The Ministerio Público has been entirely focused on prosecutors, and CSIG sees itself as a prosecutorial agency alone. That's why they're not adequate. We believe very strongly in the role of prosecution and thus the role of all three of those. But we also think that they can, through broader governmental authorities, they can convene the other participants in the building of rule of law. We've talked with Ivan Velázquez about that when he was commissioner, and he pointed out that, look, I've got a lot of big fish to fry. We have our hands full. So whoever it might be within the government needs to convene public and private together and identify the role that the private sector can play. I'll use one tiny little example. Tax evasion is rampant in a lot of Latin America, and it's part and parcel of their corrupt culture. The CEO of Walmart Latin America is Chilean and looked at this fundamental problem we have in Guatemala, where some of our suppliers may not pay their taxes, and then ultimately even potentially criminal exposure comes back on us, which discourages us from our formalizing role, which then feeds the vicious cycle, and said, well, why don't they just do a higher withholding tax? Because people pay if they have their tax withheld. That's the type of sort of practical best practice understanding that the private sector can contribute in a way that honestly the government officials involved seem to be doing an awful lot of work without something nearly as powerful as what simply having the private sector point out how withholding works in Chile could do.
Other questions? Did you have a question? Yes.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. So I like the two presenters, I want to say something shocking for a man in uniform. So it appears to me that in any conflict, there are only two ways that you succeed. One is that you achieve overwhelming force, whether that's by developing some of the issues that the presenter on the left spoke about, or you negotiate. One is unlikely and the other one is untenable. So I went to a meeting to talk about fentanyl recently, a couple of months back, and I asked one small question. If we solve the problem of fentanyl today, what will we be discussing tomorrow? Which drug? So it seems to me then that we seem to have a conceptual challenge with the way that we're attacking this problem. And that is that we always seem to attack it on the kinetic end. Do you think it's time to rebalance the way we treat the problem and maybe look at it from the social end. Because at the end of the day, what we really have is a demand and supply problem. A demand for feeling good in whatever way people choose, and a supply that will follow that demand regardless of how it has to achieve it at the end of the day.
Clay, do you have some thoughts on that? Or
Well, I don't really dive into domestic policy too much, but you're absolutely correct. And what I say is that these transnational criminal organizations and terrorist organizations, they have an unlimited supply. Drugs, are made from plants that you can make as much. These cartels, they create everything they possibly can and just throw it at the border. They don't care how much we seize. They don't care how much we stop. As long as a little bit gets through, then they make it. As long as they get that profit back, they get even higher profits. So yeah, there has to be some sort of different. I think the focus on strategy is important here, where you change the strategy. I don't know about the social aspect of it because that's a different debate that every country has to have themselves within their own governments and among their own societies. But from a strategy perspective, thinking about it differently from the supply and demand side of it, and especially the profit side of it, because in every supply and demand chain there's a profit cycle also. So I tend to focus on that because that's easier to look at and track and grasp in a conceptual framework.
If I could add a little bit, I first worked in the bureau I ran for a while, INL, in 1993. First time I engaged in the international narcotics issue. So I've been on the issue off and on for 25 years. And I offer two lessons that I learned over those 25 years. One is chronological. In the case of drugs, it takes us decades. It takes societies and communities decades to get into these crises, and it's going to take decades to get out of them. You can't have a crisis that's 40 years in the making and expect to get out of it in a year or two. The second one is what I guess I will call balance. Should we focus on demand as much as on supply? Of course we should. We will never solve a problem of this nature without addressing both aspects. And I wouldn't just say both aspects. You've got transit in between, which is an issue, and then in terms of supply, you've got cultivation, and then the laboratories, and then movement to ports of departure. And in terms of demand, you have education and treatment and rehabilitation, as well as law enforcement at the final marketplace. And at the end of the day, history teaches me, I may be stupid, but what it teaches me is your strategy must address all aspects. Now, you can change your strategy by putting more focus at times on different aspects of the problem, but if you treat the drug abuse problem as a chain of a bunch of links, and you remove one of the links completely, what happens? The chain falls down. So to some extent, if you're going to be successful over time, you have to address all aspects. Is the gentleman correct that at times we have over-focused on supply, which is heavily law enforcement, and under-focused on demand? Undoubtedly. Do we therefore want to focus exclusively on demand and forget supply? I think that would be as bad a mistake as perhaps the first mistake dating back to the 1970s. I'm done now. Thank you. Thank you for letting me vent.
Thank you. Other questions? Roger.
Thanks. A very specific question on Venezuela. Mm-hmm. Venezuela and the earlier very excellent panel. I've been stalking Bill Brownfield and saw him in an earlier panel where he was wearing his hat as uncompensated fellow at the...
Had I mentioned I'm uncompensated? I'm a senior fellow and senior advisor at CSIS.
CSIS.
Uncompensated.
And I asked the question about in order to sort of paint the Venezuela regime as a criminal enterprise, the significance of indicting some of these people. The U.S. Attorney, Eastern District of New York, Southern District of New York, Southern District of Florida, Houston, all have substantial time in, evidence, witnesses, everything at their disposal to make these indictments. And I asked Ambassador Brownfield about when the decision should be made to indict these people and pull the trigger on them and expose the fact that leaders of the regime are directly involved in narco trafficking and expose all of the evidence associated with the legal networks. Your answer then was, these decisions should be in the hands of the U.S. Attorney. And reading between the lines,
you hear that?
reading between the lines, that you explicitly said, and not something that interagency process should interfere with. Is the interagency process interfering with the decision of U.S. attorneys in making these decisions to indict people? And if not, at what point does it make sense from a diplomatic standpoint, making this case to the rest of the world about the nature of this regime, does it make sense for people to pull the trigger and indict some of these individuals?
And I'd add seizures onto the back end of that, because I think there's withholding on seizures as well.
So whether and when to indict is a decision that the United States makes in its sovereign capacity. And that's not a light thing, whether it's indicting a drug dealer on a street corner or a local public official accused of corruption. I have a practice when I prepare my indictments for filing and return. The people who help us kind of type things out and format, they always write, it's like United States of America, comma, plaintiff v. so-and-so, comma, defendant, period. I always delete plaintiff, always. The United States isn't a plaintiff. The United States, in its sovereign capacity, is charging an individual or a group of people with a crime. And for those of us who have been and are prosecutors, it's one of the most momentous decisions you make. Is when you recommend, I'm going to bring to bear the power of the United States and our criminal regime against this person or this group of people. So, look, from the perspective of the Department of Justice, it is exclusively the province of the Department of Justice to decide whether and when to indict. It just is. Now, can that decision and can policy factors and other considerations be informed by dialogue with folks who are our colleagues in USG who are better equipped than we are to tell us things about environments in which we operate? How's that for a government answer? Yes, I think the answer is yes. I think, I didn't do a single thing when I was working cases involving the East Asia and the Western Pacific, overseas. I didn't do a single thing without talking to OIA, which is the Office of International Affairs within DOJ, and then without talking to our friends at the State Department. And that includes folks in the embassy who are out there. Every time I've needed help extraditing someone, State's been there. It's been wonderful. So again, we have the best government in the world, bar none. We have all kinds of resources, all kinds of talented individuals and people who bring expertise that no prosecutor could ever wish to have. It behooves all of us to pull the levers of government when we make decisions. I really believe that. But at the end of the day, dialogue is one thing and action is another. And when it comes to whether and when to indict, that's a Department of Justice law enforcement decision.
Other questions? Well, I want to thank the American Enterprise Institute on behalf of the Federalist Society for hosting us in this magnificent facility today. I want to thank all of you for coming, and I want to thank our panelists for enlightening us today, both on this panel and our earlier panel. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And this day's proceedings are concluded. Thank you.
Thanks.